Welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. We're here to facilitate inspiring dialogues about the nature of consciousness across disciplines, communities, and practitioners, all with a holistic perspective.
From energy healing to somatic therapies, from neuroscience to meditation, we believe the most interesting things happen at the boundaries of disciplines.
I'm Christabel.
And I'm Keith.
Thanks for joining us today and enjoy the episode.
Hello, here with us today is Helané Wahbeh, the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University, and president of the Parapsychological Association. Dr. Wahbeh is clinically trained as a naturopathic physician and research trained with a Master of Clinical Research and 2 postdoctoral research fellowships. She's published on and spoken internationally about her studies on complementary and alternative medicine, mind-body medicine, extended human capacities, stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and their relationships to physiology, health, and healing. Dr. Wahbeh is especially known for her research around a noetic approach to channeling. She's most recently authored the book, The Science of Channeling, Why You Should Trust Your Intuition and the Force That Connects Us All, published in 2021. Welcome, Helané.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you today.
Oh, very, very happy to be with you as well. So let's start with the basics. I'd ask if you could kindly define what it is you mean when using the term channeling, and perhaps that will also lead us to understand the difference between channeling and being psychic, if there is one.
So I have a unique definition of channeling. It's one that's actually quite broad. I define channeling as the process of accessing information and energy not limited by our conventional notions of time and space, and that can appear expressive and also receptive. And so this is a broad umbrella term that includes a wide spectrum of experiences, from intuitive gut hunches on one side, all the way to perhaps more rare experiences like mediumship and trance channeling on the other side, and everything in between, from precognition to telepathy to psychokinesis, etc. And so people might say, well, where does ESP or psychic or psi, where do all those words fit in? And I would put them under the umbrella of channeling, and that each of those are essentially referring to different manifestations of our ability to access this non-local.
Amazing that you mentioned non-local there. You mentioned in your book that consciousness itself is non-local. And this is a central point around understanding the phenomena of channeling and consciousness itself. Can you explain a little to our viewers a little more about this important concept for understanding how consciousness and even intention work?
Absolutely. And it really is a big crux that is so important when talking about these topics. So if you spoke to a traditionally trained neuroscientist who prescribes to a materialistic paradigm, they would tell you that our consciousness is generated by the effects of our neurons, by our physical brain, that our consciousness is emergent from the physical brain and is also contained by the brain and doesn't have any effect or ability to sense beyond the physical brain or the body. And what we see through many experiments, through spontaneous experiences, that our consciousness does extend beyond our physical brain and body and can actually perceive things what we call non-locally. So, normally we would say, okay, whatever I perceive by my 5 senses that are in my body is what my consciousness is limited to. And yet we have so many experiments and experiences of people who can actually perceive things at a very far distance, from the past, from the future. Our consciousness is not limited to the physical space of our brain and body, and also not limited to this specific present moment.
That's interesting, Elena. I'm really taking a step back to that definition of channeling there for a moment, because that's really broad, in a really wonderful way, actually. Talking about this non-locality, as you see it, where is this information that's being channeled come from? Are we looking at the unconscious, higher self, a large universal field, separate disincarnate beings or identities, or is it all inclusive of those sort of sources,
That's a wonderful question. It's always one of the most popular questions that I get. The short answer is I don't know what the source is. A more nuanced answer is it's probably all of the above, and that each situation that we look at is unique. And perhaps some people, when they are tuning in, if you will, for guidance, are tapping into a part of themselves, what we might call a higher self, or tapping into their unconscious. Perhaps someone else is tapping into something different. And, while we can't prove that discarnate beings are real with the tools that we have today, there's many cultures around the world who believe that there are discarnate beings that do support us, that we can communicate with. And so many people believe that that is the source of their information. And so I think that answer to your question is very nuanced and needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And that from my perspective, I talk about this a lot in the book, is, inviting people not to get stuck on what the source is, but to focus more on the content that actually is coming through, and also how useful that content is to the person in terms of supporting them in their daily lives and being a better person, if you will, and improving their quality of life. And to also not get attached to what the source is, because you'll see a lot of people with channeling say, oh, this was channeled and it was channeled by this being or that being, and they project their authority onto this channeled information. And I argue that that's all well and good, and yet we really need to use discernment about the information that's coming through, and if that information is useful, healthful, supportive, just like the silly saying of like, well, if your friend told you to jump off a cliff, would you do it because it came from your wonderful friend? No, of course not. There's a level of discernment that we need to use to be able to know if this is information that we want to use in our lives.
It also brings me to this idea of, given this breadth, what's your personal story with regards to channeling? How did you first come into contact with the idea initially, and decide to make it a key area of your professional research?
So I had my first experiences as a young child with channeling, was very, very sensitive, and, felt things that other people didn't feel. And I was fortunate to have a mother, and my whole mom's side of the family very steeped in the esoteric. And my mother took me to a spiritualist type meeting when I was 10 years old. And those meetings went on throughout my childhood. And I was deeply influenced by a spiritualist type belief system that my mother's side of the family taught me. My father's side was Orthodox Christian, and I also went to church every Sunday, and also went to Catholic school. So I had a very diverse spiritual upbringing. So this was a very strong aspect of my personal life, and I was very interested in healing, especially mind-body medicine, and ended up going to naturopathic medical school and getting into clinical research, studying meditation at an academic university. But my channeling piece was kind of, in the closet, if you will, because I could never really speak about that in my academic university. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is that these spiritual meetings, my uncle was a trance channeler and would go into a trance state, as would my mother, as would my grandmother when she was alive. So I had a lot of experience observing trance channeling from trance channelers who I knew very intimately, who were not doing it for money, who had no motivation to make it up. So I had that very strong firsthand experience. So as a fast forward, I'm doing meditation research. I'm National Institute of Health funding. I'm doing all this really wonderful work looking at post-traumatic stress disorder and how mindfulness meditation could help improve that, and was invited to go to the Institute of Noetic Sciences for a meditation research or work group to talk about Western medicine research of meditation and what was missing in that. What were the pieces that were not being addressed by Western research on this Eastern tradition, really? And I came to IONS, which is the acronym for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and was just completely amazed at the courage that they had to ask all these outrageous research questions about these esoteric topics, and became very excited to join their team, and it kind of unfolded from there. So I was able to join as a consultant and then as an employee, and then now find myself as director of research. So IONS is incredible in that we really apply the scientific method to any research question, and specifically about consciousness, various aspects of consciousness, and how it can affect the physical world, and how we can access all these other aspects of consciousness. So for the first time in my life, I'm actually able to have my personal experience come through and be able to apply my clinical research training to these topics of personal interest to me.
I love the scientific inquiry into these things, which are hard to grasp. And I'd love to keep coming back around to this. This is where I could ask you a million questions. But you did just mention about having a family lineage, an ancestral skill. So I know you touch into this in the book. So do you believe that channeling abilities, certain kinds of energetic sensitivities are being passed through in a generational sense? And if so, what might the mechanisms be if there's anything above and beyond simply genetic transmission?
My hypothesis is that we all have the capacity to channel in some way, but that the way that each person channels is unique to them. And I'm speculating that that unique way is in part determined by our genetics. Now, have I demonstrated this through research studies yet? No, we're still working on that, but that's kind of the hypothesis that I'm working with right now. We did one small study that did find a significant difference between high functioning cases and controls that was actually in the non-coding region of the DNA, which is quite fascinating. And so that was a small pilot study. It needs to be replicated. And we're currently still trying to obtain funding so that we can continue that research program. Now, the second part of your question was about, I think, a little bit about the nature-nurture, if I can read into that a little bit. So I think that there is some aspect that likely is genetic, but I don't think that's the whole picture, because we do know that people who believe that they can and are interested and motivated and practice can learn things like remote viewing, psychokinesis, channeling, trance channeling. We know that people can learn that with belief and interest. And so at some level, anyone could probably learn these various types of channeling abilities. Now, whether they're going to be the superstar NBA player of that specific skill, maybe that's more determined by a genetic component. And so there's, I think, that interplay. We also can consider children who are raised in a family who is open to these topics, who are not suppressed when they start seeing things or experiencing things. They have a construct, a container that holds them when they do that, that would allow them to feel nurtured and supported in their abilities, compared to another family where it's like, no, that's crazy, don't talk like that. And it's, completely suppressed. And then maybe later in their life, they start exploring it on their own again. So I think that also is probably a big piece of it.
One thing that interests me, even putting aside the scientific community, is that in many esoteric communities, or we might use the term New Age there as another term, despite a great amount of open-mindedness about large areas of psychic phenomena or far-out concepts, there still remains a certain amount of skepticism and taboo around this idea of mediumship. And you mentioned the trance mediumship. Why do you think that is?
I think that, there's a few reasons. One is we are in this shifting paradigm situation. So I talked about materialism. I talked about how, the dominant belief is that our brain generates consciousness. And so, there's a lot of theories about consciousness not being emergent from the brain, but they're not in the dominant paradigm, right? So we're moving from this materialistic paradigm to a post-materialistic paradigm where consciousness is non-local, likely fundamental, and yet it's not fully accepted yet. So we're in this place of straddling two different paradigms. So I think that's one piece. I think the other piece is, frankly, just fear. I think people are afraid of what it means if humans actually do have these capacities, and they take it to the extreme. And you see all these sensational Hollywood movies, which I actually love superhero movies, but it's also scary, right? So so-and-so can zap me with their laser beam eyes and harm me in some way, or someone's going to be able to read my mind, or what if my intentions are immediately manifest and I'm driving and I have road rage, and then all of a sudden I'm creating car accidents. Like, what would happen to our world if tomorrow instantly all of our intentions became manifest in that gross macro way? That's pretty scary for people to think about. And so, you mentioned the New Age community and such. There is also this idea that, humanity is not quite ready for it yet, and that there's this purposeful cap that's been put on our abilities for this very reason. Like, humanity doesn't have the spiritual maturity yet to be able to handle the responsibility of our thought forms being instantly manifest, even though that may be the true nature of how our world works, and it's being blocked in some way. I mean, obviously I can't prove any of that, but it makes logical sense to me. So the paradigm and fear, I think, are two major aspects for why it's still considered taboo in many, many circles. And that has supported a energetic of secrecy. So, every time I do a talk, I'll have so many people coming up to me afterwards saying, hey, this happened to me, but I haven't told anybody, because they're either going to think I have a mental illness, or they're just going to dismiss me. I think that specific piece is shifting a little bit, and people are feeling more and more comfortable about sharing their experiences. And I think that that's a wonderful first step to to engage in healing. And sorry, there's one more big one, and it is the post-traumatic stress from previous eras where we were literally killed for having these abilities. You know, you look at the witch trials and the Inquisition and all these different periods of human history where people were literally killed for having these abilities. So, you know, I envision that that's, you know, encoded in some way in our memories, and the idea of just being completely out in the open about this is scary.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Absolutely.
We also love some of those superhero type movies and stuff, and it seems to be some kind of, you know, sublimation or emanation from the collective psyche around a real piqued curiosity at this moment in time around these very kinds of talents and phenomena that we're discussing today. It's certainly a way of thinking as to why they're so popular at the moment. Now, I'm curious though, you talking about a paradigm shift, and you're straddling the line between being a scientist and trying to pull these other things into the scientific domain. And yet there's frustration there in terms of being able to convert things, to be able to prove things, so to speak. Understandably, you mention that there's, in your book, that there's extreme bias in academia, resulting in discriminatory and unethical practices to get the word out about channeling research. Could you go into more detail about the kinds of challenges you've faced as a researcher and scientist trying to make greater inroads into channeling and related phenomena?
We just had a recent example of this. So the gold standard in science is to publish peer-reviewed publications. So, you know, you develop your research question. There should be no limit on what your research question is. So I can apply the scientific method on any research question I want, including channeling topics. Then we conduct the study, we get the results, we write up the results, we submit it for peer review, where people then review our manuscript, look at our methods, make sure we did everything right, and then it gets published. So that's kind of the life cycle of the research question to dissemination. Now, the bias, we've experienced it. I mean, I've experienced it firsthand multiple times around, number one, reviewers saying, you are not allowed to ask this research question because the phenomenon you're asking about is impossible. Therefore, it is unscientific for you to ask this specific research question. We had a reviewer write this like 3-page scathing response to a publication that we submitted on experiences that meditators had. So we basically did a survey of over 1,000 meditators from around the world, asking if they had various experiences during meditation, including telepathic connection to their teachers, seeing supposed discarnate beings, states of timelessness, spacelessness, etc. So the reviewer said, you can't even ask those questions. It's not allowed because these experiences are impossible. It's like doing a research study on can pigs fly, because pigs can't fly. So if you do a study on it, you know, you're basically studying something that's impossible. And the editor further said, not only am I blocking this paper, I'm going to actively block any of this research and any money being spent towards it in the future. I mean, it was really intense. That was actually a few years ago. That paper has since been published and it's doing fantastic. It has really high views and is doing well. Just, I think less than a month ago, we got another rejection. And this was not for the results of a project. There's a big trend in science these days to publish your protocol before you even do the study. So it's essentially called pre-registration. So you're declaring to the world, here's what we're going to do. Here's the analysis we're doing. It is this huge effort to improve replicability and improve methods in science these days. And so we were just trying to get the protocol published. And the editor's similar type of statement, like, we can't even publish your protocol to attempt to answer your research question about this, because there's no evidence that these phenomenon even exist. So we won't even publish your protocol. And again, this editor was much more political and didn't write a scathing email, but it was a similar vein. Now, within the parapsychology community, there's a lot of chatter about how to deal with this. Part of it is, okay, maybe they're just not educated about the vast amount of information that already exists about these phenomenon. And, many people will attempt to educate and show the meta-analyses and show the various laboratory studies that have been replicated in different laboratories around the world to say, look, actually, there is evidence, and let me show you this. Other people just dismiss it and they say, you know what, it doesn't matter how much evidence we show these people. If they're entrenched in the view that it's impossible, we're not going to change their minds. And so let's focus on the people who are open and open to seeing the data and make up their own decisions. And finally, I'll just say, I'm an editor for a couple journals, and I feel really grateful that I can now be in that role, because just as, I can, in an unbiased way, provide or orchestrate peer review for some of these papers. Like, there was a systematic review that I was editing on Reiki, which is an energy medicine modality. There's a number of preliminary studies that have shown positive effect, including with, double-blind randomized controlled trials. So I was editing this manuscript through the peer review process. I sent it out to a bunch of reviewers. One came back, great paper, it needs to be improved in these ways. Another one came back, I am deeply uncomfortable with these papers being submitted, and it's, just giving credence to this total woo-woo nonsense modality. I mean, just on and on. And the paper itself was a systematic review, pulling up all of these controlled studies that were showing it. So anyway, I could give you example after example, but those are just a few that I've personally experienced. And I try not to give that negative bias a lot of attention and focus on the ways that we do have control to disseminate the studies that have been rigorously done on all these various phenomenon. But it is upsetting, and we just have to keep moving forward as best we can.
It's interesting, Helané, that you mentioned Reiki as an energy healing modality, which of course field dynamics also is. It seems odd at this point, you can talk to this better than I can, of course, but there seems to be a serious volume of scientific evidence at this point for energy healing, such as Reiki, psychic phenomena. And there's still so much resistance, as you say, in the scientific community to these skills, concepts, and ideas. It feels like we're stuck in this iteration of proving and accusations of pseudoscience, which seems to be quite simply ignoring the evidence that's easily to hand. Does this come down, as you said earlier, to the fear and the paradigm shift we're experiencing? Is there something broader? I'm not even sure if you can answer that question, but I'm intrigued to hear your insights.
Yeah, I think it goes back to those points I was making before about just the worldview is that this is impossible, And so the fact that you're even studying it, it's like does not compute, like it just doesn't compute in their worldview. There's an incredible anecdote that I think I put in the book about when the Wright brothers were creating the airplane, and people were saying, well, that's just completely impossible. And there were people standing there observing it flying, and they couldn't, it's like they literally couldn't see it because it did not fit within their worldview about how the world is supposed to work. And so I think there will be those people who are so stuck and entrenched and don't have the mental flexibility to allow room for more data coming in to change their worldview. And unfortunately, in those cases, it's like, what do they say? Science progresses one funeral at a time. And that, and actually there was an interesting study to see if that was true. And they found that it was, that the whole, specific topics that were being published on and presented were really limited to the main players in that arena at the time. And then once those main players went away, then there was this huge outpouring of creativity and different models and theories, et cetera, that were coming forth when the main players in that major area went away. It's quite fascinating. So I really do think there's a huge piece about our human perception, our worldview, and our beliefs about what the world is like and how it's supposed to be, and that influences the filters through which we receive data coming in.
It makes me think, I forget, there's a 20th century mathematician who mentions that everything that we understand rationally has to be originally drawn from an irrational space. And of course, we understand that science and modernity, science is supposed to be the unbiased one who's willing to negotiate that threshold shift. And yet, frustratingly, being in that field, we see there truly is a lot of bias there. I do want to get back to some of the practical components around how this might be applicable to people, some of your insights in the book. But while we are on this thread, I have a particular question for you. Now, we in field dynamics, we're really focused on energy work, energy healing, augmenting the human energy field. And for us, we don't question the existence of this. Christabel and I both have different skills that we're able to see it, interact with it, know it firsthand. It's not a theoretical thing, but a lived experience. You mentioned in your book that when people connect to this thing called energy, and they usually start using these words like frequency, right? And yet we can't seem to actually take a picture, so to speak, of this in the laboratory yet. It's like, we know we have a human energy field. We know there's this electromagnetic field around the body, yet we don't have good imaging techniques. What do you think is going on there? What do we need to do in the lab to be able to capture this? Can we capture this? I'm so curious about a cutting edge kind of understanding as to how is it that we haven't yet captured, measured, understood the human energy field better, given that it definitely is there, yet the laboratory can't seem to pin it down. What's going on there?
Great question. And it's one of my big questions too. And when we have collaborations with the Consciousness and Healing Initiative and multiple other interested organizations and researchers who have that same exact question. It's like, how do we need to visualize it? Like, that's the first step for us to really move the field forward in a major way. You'll be really excited to know that there is a huge project underway to do just that, and using multiple different measurement techniques, including quantum noise generators, infrared, various, different tools that are being used simultaneously that will be mathematically combined. So perhaps it's not, we've just looked at it one at a time. So what this project is doing is actually going to be looking at all of those devices for the same session and trying to look at them multidimensionally to see if that allows us to visualize it. So we're really excited about that. Our addition to that is a quantum noise generator array. So these are devices that essentially are like random noise generators, but we've hooked together many of them on this array. And so it's essentially going to give this pattern of zeros and ones, if you will. And the reason we're excited about that is we did a large energy medicine study, and we saw that these specific devices showed differences during the energy medicine session versus the control conditions. So it is sensitive to something going on. So we're hoping that in this array field, when they're placed on the body, that we'll be able to detect something with those. So stay tuned for the results of that project.
It sounds like an exciting development. A big part of what we do at Field Dynamics is using the power of intention to heal, which I know is something that you discuss in the book as well, to affect other people's bodies and energy fields from our perspective. Can you share a little of your own research and conclusions around this idea of intention and healing?
That's around, how our intention affects the physical world. And there's so many different ways I could talk about that. I think one of the most important for your audience to understand is that belief matters, that actually one of the strongest predictors for doing well on psychic tasks in the laboratory and for having experiences in daily life is the belief that it exists and that you can actually do it. So that's a basic tenet of intention, if you will. Holding the belief that these experiences are possible, that your intention makes a difference and can affect the physical world. Then there's a number of many different studies that have looked at the effect of positive healing intention on numerous different targets. And we've seen this with in vitro cells, with plants, with animals, and with humans. These have been repeated numerous times. The effect sizes that we see in these studies range from like 0.14 to 0.25. And those numbers may not mean anything to you, but essentially what it means is that the effects are small. They're on the smaller side, and yet they're not zero. If consciousness didn't affect the physical world, there would be no effect whatsoever. It would be zero. And yet we're not seeing zero, we're seeing something. So especially in the cases of in vitro cells and plants and animals, et cetera, where placebo is not at play, it's quite remarkable that we're seeing these effects. We also see the effect of intention in a number of laboratory paradigms, such as remote staring, where people can feel others' intention through staring. We see it through another protocol called the distant mental intention of living systems. And that's where pairs of people were brought into the lab. They're hooked up to brainwave, heart wave, etc. Devices. And one person directs their positive intention towards the other person alternatingly. And we actually see changes in the physiology of one of the pairs when the person's directing their intention towards them. So those are just, a very brief overview of the multiple paradigms that have been done to study this idea of intention influencing the physical world. We also just know of it anecdotally when healers are working with their clients or participants or patients, whatever you want to call them, that having that intention improves outcomes. And, this is kind of said over and over again. And I'd be curious to know if you experienced that as well in your modality.
we certainly have reliable, positive results in the work that we're doing. And the feedback is the proof in the pudding for us, let alone, of course, knowing the mechanism firsthand. So there's the self-practice, and then there's working with others. And if you go 2 for 2 there, then there's a whole lot of confidence that things are going as planned, working well. Speaking on a personal level, how might you apply this yourself? Do you have a self-healing practice? You kind of outline a certain kind of protocol in the book. I'm wondering if you use that, or do you have a healing practice? What do you like to do?
I have a regular practice. I have a regular meditation practice where I help, keep my mind focused and clear. And I will regularly, I call it tuning in. I say I'm going to tune in, and I do my, channeling process where I get into a clear, grounded state and ask various questions, whether it's personal questions about how I'm doing or guidance in terms of my research, and get insight into, which path to take. And in terms of healing, I am trained as a Reiki master. So I also will do specific energy sessions on myself, on my kiddos, to help, move the energy, support our energetic bodies, physical bodies, etc., as well, depending on, where we're at in our lives. So this is a, inherent part of my daily life, and I absolutely use the tools every day in one way or another. I'm also very energetically sensitive, and so my daily practice multiple times a day includes clearing and cleansing my energy field so that I can maintain my integrity of that and support my nervous system so that I don't get overwhelmed by the many people and energies I'm exposed to every day. And just the energy of the world right now is pretty intense. So yeah, at a minimum, I'm doing that every day.
I think it's certainly very helpful, Helané, to hear your personal experience with that. For many of our listeners, they're on the journey of establishing or understanding their ESP, if you want to call it that, their extrasensory perception. Many of them may have heightened sensitivities and have had struggles in knowing how to read and process the amount of information they receive. I also found it very touching to hear you talk about your maternal lineage and the mediumship side and the heartfelt connection I could sense to the spiritualist community in your youth. And I wonder if there was a particular experience in your childhood or your development where experientially that was it for you. You were just aware, and there was, as they say, there was no convincing you otherwise that this phenomena, etc., exists and is very much around us.
Yeah. I think one of the more profound experiences, I had so many, but one that affected me very personally, I had, when I was 16, I was into horseback riding, and I was in a horse riding show, and it was my first one, and I was really excited, but not very experienced, and had a crash, and I hurt myself really bad to the extent that I couldn't walk. And so my family happened to be at my grandparents' house that day. I think it was a Sunday. So I was done with my event. They got me in the car, went to my grandparents' house, and my uncle actually did a healing session on me. And I remember just feeling this very, very intense heat, and that his hands were so incredibly hot. And I have no clue how long that session lasted, maybe 20 minutes, half hour, maybe an hour. And when he was done, I was able to walk again. It was still tender, it was sore, but prior to that, I couldn't even move my legs without excruciating pain. So that was such a very real, practical example of the hands-on healing, that it was no doubt in my mind. And, why would they fake that? And how could they fake that? And, maybe my placebo was so strong that I created that. And if so, then that's the power of my own mind. So that was a really strong pivotal experience in my upbringing. And I'd say around that age, around 16, I really kind of began my own personal delving into who am I? What's my purpose? What am I doing here? What's my role here on this planet? It was a time of great awakening for me personally.
So speaking to that, just to take exactly what you said, what's my purpose here, role on the planet? You've fused this beautiful mix of scientific development as well as this energetic one, or we might say a focus on the rational and the irrational, or that's limiting it. But nonetheless, I'm wondering, what do you feel is your hopes in putting out a book like The Science of Channeling, doing all of the work that you're doing, being a president, a director of research, all of these things? Is there a carrot leading in front of you?
This, I set the intention every day, let me be a channel of divine love. That's kind of my core guiding principle, if you will. And that, it's not about Helané for me. And yes, I have an ego. My ego shows up and, chimes in every once in a while. And yet I'm always bringing myself back to this core of let me be a channel of divine love. And what does that look like, right? I'm in this incredible place of leadership right now, which I am so grateful for, and am excited to use that to help orchestrate greater awakening in people about our consciousness not being limited to our physical brain, that we are more than our physical bodies, that yes, the material has a useful place in our lives, but it's not the be all end all. There's so much more than that. And at a very practical level, I have found in my own life and in everyone that I've spoke to, that when people awaken to this greater aspect of themselves, whatever the source of it is, when they're practice tapping into this noetic wisdom, that their lives are easier, they're healthier, they're happier, they're kinder, they are more creative. Solutions show up for them in their life. They stop banging their heads against the wall, trying to go down paths that don't serve them, and find that their lives are just more easeful. So I want that for everybody. I would love everyone to experience that. There is such suffering and pain in our world right now. We have so many problems that we're trying to figure out what to do with. And why not? Why not use these tools to support us in some way? So that's, I feel, my kind of core purpose is to use my leadership, to use my research tools, but also my personal channeling tools to help move this work forward. And I remember sitting in the publisher house when we were first talking about this book, and they were probing me in that same way, like, what is this? What's the purpose? What is this for? Why do you want to do this? And I remember, saying, I want people to hold this book up and say, see, I'm not alone. I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who's experienced this. Not only that, there's all this science that's been done on it. And I'm not crazy. And, let's start talking about this and how we can use it to help us in our world.
You speak with great clarity and eloquence on that matter. It's a pleasure to hear you speak of your intentions. I know many of those sentiments are shared by Keith and myself. I wonder what the plans are for the future, what stones there are to be turned over, and how you might summarize, if such a thing is possible, your goals and intentions for the future, your professional career as it continues to unfold. What would demarcate a great ongoing continuous success for you at this stage?
Thank you. Yes, next steps. I'm really excited to explore more fully this concept of the noetic signature. So I should talk about that in the book, and I alluded it in this interview about our unique expression. Each of us has this unique expression for how our channeling shows up in the world. So we've finished a number of studies now on this concept that I'm calling the noetic signature, and that it shows up in 12 different characteristics for people, and that some have different expressions of those 12 different characteristics. And so we've developed an inventory, a 44-item inventory that allows people to explore how their unique expression shows up on those. And there's a number of different studies that pour out from that. What's the prevalence of those 12 different characteristics? Do they change over time? Can they be trained? Do people who have, 3 of them in a certain pattern, are there patterns of the different 12 that show up in particular ways? Back to the genetics, is there genetic aspects that line up with the different 12 characteristics? And then working with our experience department, what curriculum can be developed to support people to nurture each of those if they want to? So we're really excited at IONS to go more deeply into this noetic signature aspect, the research aspects, and also the experience aspects. So we have this noetic handshake of science and direct experience as we move forward. So stay tuned for that really exciting work and program at IONS.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. So this is a term that you've coined called the noetic signature.
That's right.
So we urge people to go further with that in reading your book, which is full of all kinds of insights and really does provide a wonderful umbrella for the different kinds of phenomena that you've used the word channeling to describe. As you said at the beginning, there's such a diversity of things that it's covering, but you kind of map it out very well in the book, and we hope people listening will make sure to check that out.
We have an active study right now of the noetic signature inventory. So if people go to our website and go to the participate in research page, they can actually take the noetic signature inventory themselves, and we'll send them a report with their score. So that's an exciting way for the audience to get engaged. We also have all of our peer-reviewed publications and projects and everything on our website at www.noetic.org.
Thanks for sharing that website. That's perfect. And is there any other places where people can reach out or experience your work, or is that the best place for them to connect to initially?
That website is a wealth of information. We also have free webinars on Fridays. There's other studies that you can participate in. We're also doing a really fun study on telephone telepathy. That experience of knowing when someone's about to call you. So that study you can check out at teletelly.org. So that's a really fun study. And we're looking at how genetics and your closeness to your family members influences how accurate you are on knowing who's calling you. So that's another fun study that your audience can participate in.
That's great. That's highlighting the importance of keeping fun and curiosity in these areas of more deeper exploration. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you here on the podcast today. Thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. You can find us at fielddynamicshealing.com.